This is 3/4 of the way through the big read. And today we have actually gotten to a point in the big read that is really, really challenging. We talk so much about racism and its impact on the world and how it affects everything that we deal with. But when we start dealing with this issue of slavery and how it all came about and the slave making process is something that most of us have um, really a challenging experience in hearing it. As a child, I remember when you got beat up, it it was bad to get beat up, but then when everybody knew you got beat up, okay, and then the worst thing was to have to tell people that you got beat up. And so sometimes when we talk about and think about the slave making process as a part of solving the race issue in America, it's hard for us to admit that. But it's something that has to be done. White people have to acknowledge it and have to understand it from the point of view of this was a fact, a reality that happened, that something that was perpetrated on Black Americans for 300 years. Black people have to acknowledge that it happened, that many of the behaviors and many of the situations we find ourselves in right now had a root cause in this whole slave making experience. And so we're going to be covering some tough pieces on that today. And so for our listeners, when you on television, when you have what do you call it? They warn you, this may be graphic. So for our listeners today, I'm going to give you a warning. This may be graphic. We've done our best to sanitize it, but the fact is the fact. And once again, if we can't acknowledge it, we can't get beyond it. So we've gone through a lot, but right now we're in you might say we're coming down the hill in the book. We're in chapter 7, and it's called The Making of a Slave. And yesterday we talked about the process from the slave making process, where the idea of taking a people from their homeland, that they were doing fine. Many people come to America to find a better life. The Africans did not come here voluntarily to find anything. They were literally kidnapped from the shores of Mother Africa and brought here against their will. And so we talk about the capture, that's stage 1, this whole process of dehumanization from being a viable living human being on the continent of Africa to being captured in nets, placed in chains, and taken to a hostile land that gave you no respect or praise. We talked about the cage, the fact that people who had been, free people roaming the plains of Africa, doing the things that they were doing and had been doing all their lives, that all of a sudden now they're placed in cages, in prisons, in dungeons. We talked about stage 3, the ship, where the people were treated. This is like the ultimate of dehumanization, where Black people, men and women, were shackled in the belly, in the guts of the ships, one next to another, where they couldn't even go to the bathroom, where they just were forced to stay there in their own increment as though they were inhuman. And then we talked about Mount Misery, where that final institution, where when they got to America, and often there was a stop along the way in the West Indies. And when we talk about Willie Lynch was a person who came from the West Indies to help the American whites master the art of, I call it, slaveology. Mount Misery was that refinement school where you learn the fine points of being a slave. And really the essence of being a slave is, what do I have to do to stay alive? What do I have to do to try to keep my family safe? And then finally, we talked about perpetuating slavery. What is the system, the process that made this happen? And so we come now to page 98 in the book. We've heard a lot of Willie Lynch, the speech of Willie Lynch. And there are people that, want to deny it and act as though it was not happening. It did not happen. And it was, this is not true. But folks, the proof is in the pudding. And so the speech of Willie Lynch, Dr. Rogers will read from that point on page 98 of Solving the Race Issue in America. Doc, you want to start with that speech of Willie Lynch?
Yes. Okay, everyone. Fasten your seatbelts for a bumpy ride. The speech of Willie Lynch. Gentlemen, I greet you here on the bank of the James River in the year of our Lord 1712. First, I shall thank you, the gentlemen of the colony of Virginia, for bringing me here. I'm here to help you solve some of your problems with slaves. Your invitation reached me on my modest plantation in the West Indies, where I've experimented with some of the newest and still the oldest methods of control of slaves. Ancient Rome would envy us if my program were implemented. As our boat sailed south on the James River, named for our illustrious king, whose version of the Bible we cherish, I saw enough to know that your problem is not unique. While Rome used cords of wood as crosses for standing human bodies along its highways in great numbers, you are here using the tree and the rope on occasion. I caught the whiff of a dead slave hanging from a tree a couple of miles back. You are not only losing a valuable stock by hangings, you are having uprisings. Slaves are running away. Your crops are sometimes left in the fields and too long for maximum profit. You suffer occasional fires. Your animals are killed. Gentlemen, you know what your problems are. I do not need to elaborate. I'm not here to enumerate your problems. I'm here to introduce you to a method of solving them. In my bag here, I have a foolproof method for controlling your Black slaves. I guarantee every one of you that if installed correctly, it will control the slaves for at least 300 years. My method is simple. Any member of your family or your overseer can use it. I've outlined a number of differences among the slaves, and I take these differences and make them bigger. I use fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes. These methods have worked on my modest plantation in the West Indies, and it will work throughout the South. Take this simple little list of differences and think about them. On top of my list is age, but it is there only because it starts with A. The second is color or shade. There's intelligence, size, sex, size of plantations, status on plantations, attitudes of workers, whether the slave lives in the valley, on a hill, east, west, north, south, have fine hair, coarse hair, or is tall or short. Now that you have a list of the differences, I shall give you an outline of action. But before I shall assure you that distrust is stronger than trust, and envy is stronger than adulation, respect, or admiration. The Black slave, after receiving this indoctrination, shall carry on and will become self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Don't forget, you must pitch the old Black male versus the young Black male. And the young Black male, turn over the page, against the old Black male. You must use the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves, and the light-skinned slaves versus the dark-skinned slaves. You must use the female versus the male, and the male versus the female. You must also have your white servants and overseers distrust all Blacks. But it is necessary that your slaves trust and depend on us. They must love, respect, and trust only us. Gentlemen, these kits are your keys to control. Use them. Have your wives and children use them. Never miss an opportunity. If used intensely for 1 year, the slaves themselves will remain perpetually distrustful. Thank you, gentlemen. As you review, do you want me to continue, Dr. Harris? I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yeah. Let's just unpack that for a minute. That letter, I think Minister Farrakhan quoted from it in the Million Man March. And that letter really, when we look at today, the distrust, the variations between the differences in people, when we look at it as a way to really create distrust and a way to manipulate control, that's a powerful piece. And when you think about it, there was one passage that was very interesting. In that last paragraph, it said, "You must also have your white servants and overseers distrust all blacks." And so this gives you a foundation for the paradigm of slave mastery, for the paradigm that we find that white Americans are locked in this paradigm is reflected in the police interactions. You know, they did an interesting study where they listened, they had the microphones on the police cameras and whatnot, and just listening to the tone of police officers interacting with different people, in 80% of the time, they could tell whether the person was white or black. And so this idea of slavery impacts black people and white people. As a result, we all find ourselves trapped in this conflicting paradigm laid out by Willie Lynch in this letter, that regardless of, you might say, the details, the impact and the manifestation, the results of this seed, we can see clearly in the past, in the slave environment, in the Reconstruction, and in the present day. These variables of distrust between white and black still persist. Distrust between black and black still persists. Even distrust between white and white persists. But the point is that to maintain this slave mentality, this distrust, and this distinction of pitting one group against another based on differences has been a powerful tool for control. Back to you, Doc.
Yes, and I think that, you know, there's been resistance as well. So I think of particularly church services, you know, the Black church, where people are in unison, where there's a call and response in the African tradition of communicating. I think of even in modern times, line dancing, right? So when people are line dancing, there is a unity in movement. And I think recently of the election cycle. Oh, I'm sorry, am I on mute? No, I'm not on mute. You're on mute. And I think recently of the election cycle and Stacey Abrams down in Georgia and Warnock, Senator Warnock, that was running for office, that were able to unite people around a particular idea and to, you know, move people toward voting. So I agree that this letter indicates a very effective methodology for sowing the seeds of distrust and sowing the seeds of disunity. And I think of instances where there's been resistance against such seeds of disunity. You're on mute. We can't hear you, Doc. I can't hear you. You're on mute. There we go.
We often talk about earlier in the book about the carryover of some of this slave mentality. You know, when I practiced law, we were in a building that was primarily Black attorneys. And on the doors, you'd see lists of the names, you know, attorneys. But when you got behind the door, you found that there were really no partnerships. And among the Black law firms, it was rare that you ever found a partnership. You had an office that people were sharing, but you didn't have that communication and partnership aspect of dividing up the profits. And you'll find as you go around the country that partnerships in the Black community are rare. They are not non-existent. But I believe that this is a carryover of that slave mentality of distrusting one another. In the era before integration, you know, when I grew up, we had Black businessmen, Black cab companies, Black undertakers, Black restaurants. But as I look back, even those were rarely partnerships. They were one independent Black man who took the initiative to set up a business, or one independent Black woman took the initiative to set up a business. So this distrust is profound, and it perpetuates in many instances even to today. Back to you, Doc.
Yeah, and I agree that it's there. I also think of instances like North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, where there was more than one individual that came together to build a business that generated millions of dollars, that helped to finance North Carolina Mechanics and Farmers Bank. And I think of the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, and those, at one point, those African-American banks that dotted across the nation, and those insurance companies. So I agree with you. I think that it did sow the seeds. I seek also to locate, identify, and lift up where there was resistance to this division, where there are examples of people working together and achieving, goals collectively. Yes, sir. So shall I continue with the text?
Yes.
In terms of Frederick Douglass on the speech?
Yes, go right ahead.
Great.
You see, Gerard is here now.
Oh, welcome, Gerard. We can pass the mic. Let me see on my phone. I don't quite see him here. Can we hear him?
Test 1, 2.
Yes, we got you.
My mic sounds nice.
Check 1.
My mic sounds nice.
Check 2. Hey, everybody. Meet Mr. Gerard Johnson. This is John Coltrane's festival down in Hamlet, North Carolina. He is the curator. I want to say the creator. I'm not sure if it was done in concert with others. Yes. And he's an alumni of North Carolina A&T State University. Yes. And he is worldwide, and he's a man about town. And he's going to read with us today, picking up where I left off with the Frederick Douglass speech on Willie Lynch. Is there anything else you'd like for us to know about you?
Well, I'm the founder of the John Coltrane Music Edutainment Fest. We founded it in 2008, right after I got through working with Obama's campaign. Doing a lot of grassroots. And then I'd met people like Dizzy Gillespie when I was at A&T, when Marcel spoke my freshman year. John Coltrane's uncle on his mom's side, his name is John Blair, Reverend Blair's son. He lived across the street from me on the beloved Charlotte Street in Hamlet, North Carolina. And, some other things in there. But actually, my paternal grandfather, T.J. Higgins, Attorney James Higgins, originally from Louisiana, Zachary area. Dr. Fred McQueen, the first Black physician for the 82nd Airborne, one of the first. And Dr. Wendell Wells, A&T grad, Wendell Wells III, Navy pilot, and his dad was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. So they basically, instead of waiting on other folks in these rural areas, they put their money and their minds together. They bought the birthplace in the early 80s. So now it's on the National Register.
Yeah, Gerard, could you speak up just a little bit and maybe angle your camera down just a little bit so we see more of your head?
Okay. Is that better there?
Yeah, that's better. Uh-huh. Yeah.
You're looking good. Tell us maybe one or two more things before we jump back into the text here with Frederick Douglass speaks on Willie Lynch on page 101, Gerard.
Okay. And really, I want to invite everybody out. We do the John Coltrane Music Edutainment, because we're not just limited to jazz. We deal with all genres.
Okay.
The foundation is blues, actually, for just about all genres.
Got it. We'll come back and visit that. My apologies, a bit more in the program. Can we jump back into the reading now?
Okay, we'll do this.
Thank you.
Where it says the following treatise.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
Frederick Douglass speaks on Willie Lynch. Quote, the following treatise to the knowledgeable will be the missing link that has been sought to explain how we were put into the condition that we find ourselves in today. It confirms the fact that the slaveholder tried to leave nothing to chance when it came to his property, his slaves. It demonstrates how out of necessity, the slaveholder had to derive a system for perpetuating his cash crop, the slave, while at the same time insulating himself from retribution by his unique property. A careful analysis of the following handbook will hopefully change the ignorant among our people who say, quote, why study slavery, unquote. Those narrow-minded people will be shown that the condition of our people is due to a scientific and psychological blueprint for the perpetuation of the mental condition that allowed slavery to flourish. The slaveholder was keenly aware of the breeding principles of his livestock. Wow. And the following treaties demonstrated that he's thoroughly used those principles on his human livestock as well, the African slave, and added a debilitating psychological component as well. Let Us Make a Slave, What Do We Need by Willie Lynch.
Okay, Gerard, I'll pick up there because that's a hard read and we wanted to make some kind of in-flight adjustments. So
Okay.
I'll pick up there. But one, I want to thank you. You read that and sounded very much like Frederick Douglass in laying out his case.
All right.
And you know,
well, I appreciate that. That's big shoes to follow there.
big shoes. Well,
And-
you know, just as a preamble to what Frederick said in the portion I'm going to read, you know, Willie Lynch's speech, you have to wonder what was in his bag. What was this foolproof method for controlling Black slaves? And Frederick Douglass was a former slave, so he knew stuff firsthand. Wasn't like he read it somewhere. He had been a former slave who became an orator, an author, and one of the foremost leaders in the abolitionist movement. And he said this, he said, Frederick Douglass' speech, Let Us Make a Slave, What Do We Need, attributed to Willie Lynch, was this speech that I'm going to share in a moment, was taken from the African American History Resource in the African American Almanac. And what Frederick Douglass went on to say, there was an interesting quote from him. Someone once said, well, you know, being a slave is not that bad. You know, once again, the paradigm of white and Black people that, you know, we saved these savages from the wilds of Africa, and hardly did they do that. Hardly did they do that, but that was a paradigm that they needed to project themselves. But Frederick Douglass once said to a person who had posed that challenge, and he said, if you spend one day as a slave, all of your opinions will be changed. So I'm going to read now from the,
if we can, Dr. Harris, right before we jump into it, I
Mhm.
wanted to ask Gerard just a real brief question. Gerard Morrison, and I called him Johnson earlier. Forgive me, sir. You were reading, and there was something that struck you, you know, in a way because you responded, wow. What was that particular comment that Dr. Harris wrote in documenting Frederick Douglass's speech on Willie Lynch that struck you in that manner?
Part about the whole thing that, you know, because I've read the Willie Lynch letter in the past several times.
Yes.
I was trying to find it.
For me, it was the cash crops comment. It was this notion, Dr. Harris, that you document that Frederick Douglass understood that human beings were, for those slaveholders, the enslavers, a cash crop, a way to increase finances, and that the money motivation was behind this particular letter and this notion of disunity. That was it for me. Anything else from you, Gerard, before we turn it back over to Dr. Harris for the read?
Yes, that livestock just being relegated to, you know, first thing I thought is, you know, swine or something that you slaughter. My major was agricultural business at A&T. So when I looked at just the relegation sometimes, but when you, even though we read it, we hear it, but when you're saying it yourself out loud,
I know.
Especially when it's something that's totally against your personal paradigm.
Exactly.
Maybe that's that internal shock, because I'm like, those words don't sound right coming out of my mind, but I know it's a reading. And something I did think of too, if it's okay, in the spirit of Willie Lynch, well, in that division piece, you were on the call earlier too, you know, I'll be going after this one, with folks dealing with the policy on African HBCUs.
Yes.
And a friend that invited me, he went to A&T, he lives in South Africa now. One of the things we were talking about was the brain drain in areas, but I was also talking about earlier when you were talking about partnerships and different things. Shelley Green and Paul Pride did a book some years ago called Black Entrepreneurship in America. And when I was breaking down to my friend, it kind of follows with this when we talk about the division amongst us with age, with race. But for Black business during that time, the data showed that over 70% of the business owners were sole proprietors working 18 hours a day. So
wow, you must have heard Dr. Harris earlier because we were going back and forth on this very point. Please continue.
all right, well, you know,
Bring us home with it. Yes.
I'm a specialist in Black economics first, but the part about the economics, a lot of times we run to the numbers first. You know, I call them dollar chasers. And I'm not sure where this is, but y'all have heard me say this before. Came up with this slogan. I don't really say it out public, but it came to me. It was an epiphany one day. It said, you can dangle a dollar, not give it to them, but dangle a dollar and make a nigga holler. And watch how they sell out their own race, sell out their own folks for court, sell out their own friends. And then that part where I was looking at was, it wasn't just the dollar or the economics, because something, y'all know, Joe Dudley Sr. was one of my economic mentors, and Herman Gist was my political mentor. But both of them were economic based, and they were about civil rights in addition to the civil rights, along with J. Kennedy.
Okay.
But what they said, what I looked at, the divorce rate in America is over 62% for the black community, 51% for America. So we're not getting along. The employment status, over 60% of people are not happy with their jobs, even before Corona. And when I did HR, working with employment security, one of the things I noticed with the data, it showed how most people were upset with their jobs because of their first line supervisor. So all this boils down to is interpersonal relationships, be it marriages, be it business partnerships, why we can't stay along, be it music, why can't the group stay together? I mean,
Right.
5 Heartbeats still hurt me every time I see it that they broke up.
I got it. Yeah. Thank you for that insight. And that is directly connected to the reading that you just had. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the vibration. We must be in the same link this morning. Same vibration this morning.
Including this idea of hearing certain words come out of one's mouth that one wouldn't normally say. Oh, yeah. That's Dr. Harris and I had a conversation about that earlier as we turn it over to him for the reading. Thank you.
Was that a Scooby-Doo moment? But I was like,
Yeah, I don't really say those words. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Dr. Harris. You're on mute, Dr. Harris.
All right. Well, I tell you, thanks so much, Gerard, for that insight, because it's almost like an update on the philosophy we've been talking about. And this portion I'm going to read now, we often talked about, we've heard and read the letter of Willie Lynch, but this is the bag of tricks that Willie Lynch, this is the document, as they say, that was prepared to give the slave owners a step-by-step approach. And so I'll share this with the idea, as they say, I'm going to warn you because it may really inflame your sensibilities, but it's truth. This is what happened. You can document it forward and backward. So here we go. Let Us Make a Slave. What Do We Need by Willie Lynch. I'm going to do a little translating just to help us. First of all, we need to find a Black Negro. Now, I just translated. In the original text, it was the N-word. So I just translated it. First, let us find a Black Negro man, a pregnant Negro woman, and her baby Negro boy. Second, we will use the same basic principle that we use in breaking a horse, combined with some more sustaining factors. We reduce them from their natural state in nature, whereas nature provides them with a natural capacity to take care of their needs and the needs of their offspring. We break that natural string of independence from them and thereby create a dependency state so that we may be able to get from them the useful production for our business and pleasure. Cardinal principle for making a Negro. For fear that our future generations may not understand the principle of breaking both horses and men, we lay down the art. For if we are to sustain our basic economy, we must break both of these beasts together, the Negro and the horse. We understand that short-range planning in economics results in periodic economic chaos. So that to avoid turmoil in the economy, it requires us to have breadth and depth in long-range comprehensive planning, articulating both skill and sharp perception. We lay down the following principles for long-range comprehensive economic planning. Number one, both horse and Negroes are no good to the economy in the wild or natural state. Number two, both must be broken and tied together for orderly production. Number three, for orderly futures, special and particular attention must be paid to the female and the youngest offspring. Number four, both must be crossbred to produce a variety and division of labor. Number five, both must be taught to respond to a peculiar new language. Number six, psychological and physical instruction of containment must be created for both. We hold the above six cardinals as truths to be self-evident, based upon following discourse concerning the economics of breaking and tying the horse and Negro together, all inclusive of the six principles laid down above. Note, neither principles alone will suffice for good economics. All principles must be employed for the orderly good of the nation. Accordingly, both a wild horse and a wild or natural Negro is dangerous, even if captured, for they will have the tendency to seek their customary freedom, and in doing so, might kill you in your sleep. You cannot rest. They sleep while you are awake and are awake while you are asleep. They are dangerous near the family house, and it requires too much labor to watch them away from the house. Above all, you cannot get them to work in this natural state. Hence, both the horse and the Negro must be broken. That is, break them from one form of mental life to another. Keep the body and take the mind. In other words, break the will to resist. Now, the breaking process is the same for the horse and the Negro, only slightly varying in degrees. But as we said before, you must keep your eye focused on the female and the offspring of the horse and the Negro. A brief discourse in offspring development will shed light on the key to sound economic principle. Pay little attention to the generation of original breaking, but concentrate on future generations. Therefore, if you break the female, she will break the offspring in its early years of development. And when the offspring is old enough to work, she will deliver it up to you. For her normal female protective tendencies will have been lost in the original breaking process. For example, take the case of the wild stud horse, a female horse, and an already infant horse, and compare the breaking process with two captured Negro males in their natural state. A pregnant Negro woman and her infant offspring. Take the stud horse, break him for limited containment. Completely break the female horse until she becomes very gentle, whereas you or anybody can ride her in comfort. Breed the mare until you have the desired offspring. Then you can turn the stud to freedom until you need him again. Train the female horse whereby she will eat out of your hand, and she will train the infant horse to eat out of your hand also. When it comes to breaking the uncivilized Negroes, use the same process. but vary the degree and step up the pressure so as to do a complete reversal of the mind. Take the meanest, most restless Negro, strip him of his clothes in front of the remaining Negroes, the female and the Negro infant, tar and feather him, tie each leg to a different horse faced in opposite directions, set him afire and beat both horses to pull him apart in front of the remaining Negroes. The next step is to take a bullwhip and beat the remaining Negro male to the point of death in front of the female. But don't kill him, but put the fear of God in him, for he can be useful in future breeding. I'll stop right there because the next portion is on breaking process of the woman. But I'll stop right there because as distasteful as that was to read, and though many people may challenge the authenticity of the Willie Lynch system, when we look at other aspects of freedom, of the slave treatment, we can infer that this is exactly what happened. There's an interesting book called Bullwhip Days, where they talk about how the slaves were bullwhipped mercilessly, but not to kill them, just to give them a strong message that they could always take back. It talked about how women were treated, and a recalcitrant woman was treated the same way as a man. It's such an interesting, psychologists and psychiatrists, if they really looked at this slave making process, and when we talked earlier about the 100th monkey and the fact that it's a behavior modification system, one of the key points is that the behavior modification process demonstrated in the experiments of Agar and the others were behavior modification based on behaviors, physical behaviors. But the slave making process had underlying behavior modification, but it also had psychological, emotional, spiritual, and that psychic aspect that created much more than the physical bondage could create. As a man, the first law of success, the Bible says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And so this whole idea of the slave making process was to transform the thinking of the Black man, of the Negro man and the Negro woman, to a thought of total dependence on the white man for everything. It's interesting because then after this dependence has been taught for 300 years, you then get criticized and say, well, Negroes are lazy and shiftless and don't want to do anything. That's not true. They were bred to be that way. That was the essence of the whole slave making process. Many Negroes, many Black people have broken this cycle. Sandra and I was studying last night and sharing some of the early Black millionaires. We're talking about the 1900s, the 1910, 1920, 1930, when Black women like Madam C.J. Walker, millionaire, Annie Malone, millionaire, who had over 45,000 representatives, had schools and distributions in 4 and 5 countries. We don't hear much about them. But they were the exception. The rule was to create that dependence and that orderly behavior that was pleasing to the master, that was designed for economic purpose. I think that's the key point. Even Abraham Lincoln, and when you really get behind the myth of the man as the great liberator, Lincoln didn't really believe that the races could get along together. And he was also fearful, when we talked about the different compromises, the Missouri Compromise, we let in a free state and a slave state, a free state and a slave state. Lincoln had really no problem with that. And he was concerned about the economic impact of eliminating slavery. So it all goes back to economics. Then you add on to the economic driver the behavior modification, and then you add onto the behavior modification the psychological modification, and then the spiritual modification and the psychic modification, and we end up where we are right now. Back to you, Doc.
Yes, I'm wondering if you think that the thinking of Willie Lynch and the mind required to implement this inhumane treatment of other human beings, if that mind can in fact be healed. You're on mute, Dr. Harris. We can't hear you.
That mind can be healed, but it's a spiritual process. We have to take the profit motive out of it. As long as there's a profit motive, it cannot be healed. You know, the moral approach is the one that works. Think about it, Gerard. You know, in North Carolina, when they realized that when they integrated the school system, they found that black teachers were paid 40% less than white teachers.
Mhm.
Now, their food didn't cost 40% less. Their mortgages weren't 40% less. So that was a moral wrong. But in spite of that, the legislature gave itself 5 years to bring the black teachers back up to par. And so as long as there's that economic aspect of it, it cannot be solved. So the spiritual aspect is the way. And it requires those three principles. You have to first acknowledge it. And if white people can't acknowledge it, and black people we don't like to acknowledge that we've been slaves and some of the things that we or our ancestors have been subjected to. I don't like to acknowledge the fact that when I go out in public, I go suited and booted because I don't want a white police officer to think I'm one of those crazy people and shoot me. I don't like to acknowledge that, but I do it because I definitely don't want to get shot. Okay. So the acknowledgement of the reality, number one. The two, the challenge comes about in the asking forgiveness, because that requires a moral judgment. When I say, I did not do it to you personally, and I take no responsibility for it, I'm making the moral judgment that it wasn't wrong. Okay. And so as long as I make that moral judgment, it can never be fixed. So it requires that asking for forgiveness, that margin, hey, I didn't do it, but it was wrong. If my ancestors did it, it was wrong. I apologize on their behalf, and I myself apologize and say it will never happen on my watch. That's what it will take. And then the third it takes atonement. The spiritual principle says it's not enough to recognize the wrong. It's not enough to ask forgiveness for the wrong, but you must make all parties whole. And that's not just, people want to interpret it as reparations. If atonement is a basketball, a three-dimensional basketball, then reparations might be the shadow of that basketball on the floor. It's absolutely, it loses the essence of it. It's accurate, but it's a small part of it. If white people and black people, but white people in particular, can do this, can acknowledge, ask forgiveness, and agree to make atonement, we can get beyond the spiritual contradiction and make the change.
Gerard, do you have any feedback, comments to Dr. Harris's reading and statements?
I got a lot. Where you want me to go now or later?
Now, if you would be so kind. Well, let me just say that, okay, number one, it's a rough ride. It's a rough conversation to have. Number two, I think, even in the midst of the acknowledgement, for me, it's the acknowledgement of the treatment, but it's the acknowledgement of the mind required to treat other people that way. And that it is, incumbent upon people with that mindset, whether they call themselves the Proud Boys or the Klan or the President Trump, it's incumbent upon people, well-meaning people, to call them into account, right? Because based on the mind, they're already, in my opinion, not going to hear other people that they are traditionally oppressing unless it's a pain point for them. And the economic piece of it is a pain point. The Montgomery Bus Boycott, when Black folks said, we're not riding your buses, go ahead, you drive them out of yourself, and they kept their money in their pocket, it became a pain point where some of those people with that mentality that would drive the bus said, please ride our buses because we're about to lose our job. Yet I recognize that it is a double-sided coin. In many ways, it's a tetrahedron in, 7 dimensions. It's multi faceted. And I'm just looking at it from the notion of, for me, resistance, as well as pinning the tail on the donkey where in fact the problem lies. And the problem lies with the folks with that mentality, in my opinion. Gerard?
Actually, it must be that vibration. One of the things I wrote down as we were talking was Attorney Harris was talking, the sheer brutality, the savageness. And it goes to what I call I used to do advertising, one of those many jobs, speaking of tetrahedrons, however you say that fancy word at you. But the fact that the same exact things that, and it's not all whites, but these whites that we're talking about that do this, the secret nine type mentalities that we applaud later for being heroes like Josephus Daniels in Raleigh and Carolina Power and Light and the trustees for North Carolina State, the secret nine that were involved with that Wilmington massacre, and how we are so trained with our own culture, where folks will say, I'm gonna start there for what we can control. They'll say, oh, baby, don't say that. Don't say that out loud. Not now. We don't want to piss them off. And that PTSD, the post-traumatic slavery disorder, and the post-traumatic stress, the fact that this impact that you were talking about, even though we're going to get to the women next time, fibroid tumors. I tell, I've had some sisters I've dated what they've been through, and I tell them that affects us too, because when you hurt, we hurt. And, but still, stress is one of the leading causes, but, so-called scientific erudites don't want to acknowledge it as that. But that stress that's caused from working hard to try to receive us respect and appreciation from a culture that's institutionalized, that's never gonna do it. For us to even that acknowledgement, and it's crazy right here in North Carolina. I've got at Elon hearing free speakers. I got to see the first time seeing Cornel West, and the second time I got to talk with Bishop Desmond Tutu. I was in South Africa and Zimbabwe in 2003, so we talked about some things there. And what I love, speaking of respect, we were talking, there were minutes left. The president for Elon interrupted our conversation. Desmond Tutu is not a tall brother, but the bishop, you're talking about strength. And I'm going to speak to this truth and reconciliation when you say the atonement. But we were talking about Stephen Biko and some other type things that don't really get the attention. And the president abruptly just interrupted us. Bishop Desmond Tutu looked at his watch. He said, excuse me, I'm very aware of our itinerary. Oh, the president said when they were interrupted, well, we have things to go to, because he was out of the conversation and because they couldn't control it. That's really what it was. The bishop said, I'm very aware of our itinerary and we're 6 minutes ahead of schedule. So I'd like to continue talking to this gentleman. So please don't interrupt. And how many of us would do that here? And we've seen this. I like using practicality. We'd be at work. You, Dennis and Herbert, we could all be at our desk at my cube talking about the game or whatever. The white cat's gonna come there and just stand by. And we got folks who would stop what they're saying to acknowledge versus go ahead and do what you're doing. And they're supposed to show respect like our parents teach us to say, excuse me. You don't just abruptly jump in. But that comfort level, yes, they were giving Willie Lynch instruction. And I spent some time in Barbados at one of the places where, Thomas Jefferson's, I think it was his nephew or his uncle or something that lived, because they were involved with this Willie Lynch process too. Because the Caribbean was used as the test, just like in South Africa. This stuff,
right, because they said that the letter came from the Caribbean, that Willie Lynch was of the Caribbean.
Oh yeah, and that's why even stuff where like Haiti, where Toussaint the Overture, people are still on guard with Haitian policy to this day, because this stuff is perpetuated in these households. These dinners that we're not at, this stuff is talked about generation after generation. Remember, we can't go back. The cats would tell you how their grandfather was a general with the Confederate Sons of the Confederacy, the Daughters of the American Revolution. I mean, we got to call out all these groups because some of them sponsor a lot of stuff, and they're on the welcome to Hamlet signs and welcome to Raleigh signs as you come in, and they wouldn't even let your Black ass in there. So we have got to acknowledge these remnants of stuff that happened and how it impacts us to this day.
Right.
And
right.
Right. You know, you were saying something. I just want to interrupt for a second. And it brought back to mind, you know, my daughter went to a very exclusive private school in New York. For example, one of the Kennedy kids went there, and I think Kevin
Smith?
Bacon's daughter went there.
Was it Smith?
Huh?
Was it Smith?
No.
Okay.
No, in elementary school and high school. Yeah. And there were two African Americans in her class, my daughter and one other. The other young lady, her father was CEO of a major national corporation. We're talking $1 billion corporation. For example, I think when he got terminated, he walked out the door with about $100 million. So he was but there were two Black men, and we'd stand and we'd be at, you know, the functions. We'd be the only two Black people there. And we had a little joke we'd say. We'd stand off in the corner and start talking. And we would time how long it would be before a white person would come over, especially a white man would come over to interrupt and say something like, well, how you guys doing? And, you know, they want to know, what are you talking about? And so as you were sharing that, and we're not talking 100, we're talking 7 years ago. And so that's a part of that whole slave paradigm. Just as the slave has been affected by it, the slave master is affected by it. And as a result, nobody can fly. Everybody's stuck in this circular paradigm that was created by others, created by the Willie Lynches of the past. When you look at Roots, you remember a lot of this was shared in Roots. If you remember with Kutu Kente, one of the key things, they didn't want him to keep his language and didn't want him to keep his name. And all of the things that we talked about in this, you can see it happen in Roots. And when you read other books about, one of the interesting books is called Without Recourse, which is a whole treatment on the slave paradigm, the whole idea of lynching, that how you live your life when you have no recourse. You know, we live in America of courts and justice and laws, but what it does to you psychologically when you know in your heart, especially in the South in those days, that a white person could kill you and not suffer any consequences at all. And then I thought back on the talk. You know, we often as Black people kind of, you know, I remember someone saying, as a Black child, your mother always had the talk with you, where she told you, as my mother said, what I'm telling you, boy, is what you need to know to not get killed. And she said, killed. Okay. And the fact that Black women and Black fathers, but Black women in particular, are still have to have the talk with their kids just shows so how far we have to go to eliminate this paradigm, this Willie Lynch syndrome. Back to you.
And the way that the fear component, we cannot downplay that. That fear component is used even with, you know, the original, well, the first movie, Birth of a Nation, I would say the white version, you know, the Klan, the ghosts, you know, part of the reason they used the sheets was supposed to be for the ghosts. The PBS special that just happened, you know, earlier this week about the Black church. One of the things they talked about too was how one of the white writers had talked about how he imagined stuff in trees because they were so shaken up from the spiritual experience that the whites didn't understand, that they thought it was ghosts amongst the trees because they were hearing the spirituals and the songs. And you know how we get that rhythm. We don't need the music. We stomp that floor on that with that leaky roof, and we got our own studio type stuff in that church. But that fear piece is still used today. And even well-meaning sisters. Had a guy in the Army, his brother, we were in the woods about to do some war game training, but it's an old sergeant. This young brother, he had caught his wife cheating, and he was, you know, ruffled up about it. And it's unfortunate what I'm about to say, but it was wise. The brother told him, he said, "You married an American-born Black woman, didn't you?" And, you know, I'm 18 from country Hamlet, and I'm like, what's that got to do with American-born? But then he's like, it's not her fault. But basically, I'm paraphrasing now, but with this so-called transatlantic style Christianity that's been imported, she's socialized to do more for a Black preacher and a white boss than her man at home. Tell me you all have never seen that.
I hear you, and I think that we have come through this with post-traumatic slavery disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and it manifests in all sorts of ways. Like you talked about fibroid tumors, stress. The number one killer of Black men is stress. The notion that, just about every high blood pressure, someone was saying on an Oprah Winfrey show, that high blood pressure was a physical response, a survival mechanism to deal with the level of stress. So I think that in that story and in so many other stories that we could mention, the pendulum swings in terms of, what we do and what we believe. And ultimately, to get up under this, we have to deal with the Willie Lynch and the mind that perpetuates Willie Lynch. We have to pin the tail on the donkey, that this notion that microaggressions occur, like the president of the university that sought to interrupt the conversation with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the conversation that you gentlemen were having at the private school, that someone really sought to use microaggression as a way to utilize a technique of Willie Lynch, if you will. So it's becoming sensitive enough to recognize where Willie Lynch shows up, but also sensitive enough to recognize where post-traumatic stress or slavery disorder rears its head. I often say, because of the history of America, that we're fish swimming in toxic water, that the very air in which we breathe is toxic with racism, is toxic with the things we're talking about with Willie Lynch, is toxic with all of this negative behavior. And that one, a psychologist named Akbar once said, once you recognize post-traumatic stress disorder, you must constantly be about the business of healing yourself and reminding yourself, we survived, we thrived. Yes, there are all of these divorces, but there are families that stay together. Yes, there are people with messed up mindsets, but you're walking around sane. So you celebrate that which is healthy while you build upon it, as well as going back Sankofa and capture that which is unhealthy to fix it moving forward. So those are my responses to this complex scenario that we're describing, that again, in the text, Solving the Race Issue in America, Dr. Harris exercises the courage to take these things head on and to place us in a position to have these types of discussions. Dr. Harris.
Yes, Doc, we're at the end of the hour. And I'll tell you, we've done 15 sessions now. This one was so intense, it went by so fast, Gerard, it was almost like we just sat down 5 minutes ago. It doesn't seem like an hour, but that is the way of true revelation. That when something touches your heart and your spirit in a certain kind of way, time becomes irrelevant. And today, and we have a number of listeners online. We've gotten some great comments from people online. And this lady said, a lady, Afro Thought, she had made a comment. She said, it's so beautiful to hear this type of information. She said, I really like your book. It's given me food for thought. And I think that's really what this is about. When you can't show what you don't know. And so these conversations have been giving us all, even as the writer of the book, as I hear it read, I get a whole new level of understanding. When I hear it read, for example, with the passion and feeling of Gerard, when I hear Dr. Rogers reading from his perspective, it's even though they're the same words, a whole nother vibration comes with it. And so these last 15 days have taken us now, we're crossing the bridge. We've come to that point now. The most terrible thing of the entire experience of racism in America has been slavery and what has happened and what can happen. Then when we see that, and we at this point now, we'll complete this last session on Monday, but now we're heading home. Now we have seen the truth, the facts, and some people can get bogged down. I've seen some of the statements about the Willie Lynch letter that, nobody, this one couldn't verify it, etc. But there are a lot of things. It's like with George Floyd. George Floyd is murdered in front of millions of people, and there are folks who want to concentrate on the fact that some buildings were burned, or rocks thrown. That when we can look at the essence of the wrong done, we can fix it. So for all of our listeners, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to complete our live broadcast now. I invite you back next week. We have 5 more sessions, and we got some Power Pack readers coming with us next week. I invite you to join. Sign up, www.thebigread.net, www.thebigread.net. Watch it on Facebook, on the facebook.com/solving the race issue in America. And share it with somebody and make a commitment to do something yourself. You know, change begins with us. Change begins with you. And each person taking that stand can make a difference. We're going to close out the live broadcast. But those of you who are attending, one of the great things about being on the webinar is now we can chat with one another and have some dialogue. So for our friends on Facebook, on Instagram, thank you so much. We're going to close out now, and then we'll have our discussion with our friends who are on board with us. Thank you so much.